So here we are in our new section. This is all going to be about evolution for the next couple of weeks. So we need to get started first. We're going to be talking about early ideas of evolution, this guy named Charles Darwin and his observations, and then the theory of natural selection. What we need to know, we've got our key concepts. There were theories of biological and geological change before Darwin. Darwin's voyage provided insights into evolution, and Darwin proposed natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. Okay, so some early things. So early scientists proposed ideas about evolution. And evolution is change over time, and it's over a long period of time. And it's the process by which modern organisms descended from ancient organisms and have come to differ from their ancient ancestors. Some things to remember when we talk about this and going forward, a species is a group of organisms that can reproduce and have fertile offspring. Those species get together and make a bigger population inside an ecosystem. And that theory is a well-supported explanation of phenomena that have happened or occurred in the natural world. Okay, so there were actually very many important naturalists in the 18th century that helped to lead to Charles Darwin, and we'll talk about him in a few minutes, but to this theory of natural selection and therefore evolution. And so you need to know a few of these gentlemen. So we have Linnaeus, who came up with a classification system for organizing all the living things on the planet. Buffon, whose species shared ancestors rather than arising separately, so they were groupings of species that shared these ancestors. Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, actually, he came up with more complex forms developed from less complex forms. And Lamarck, who environmental change leads us to use or disuse a structure. Now, his thoughts we came to know as untrue later on. He thought the more you used them, the more pronounced these structures became, but it's not true. Anyway, but all of them led to Darwin, or Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and evolution. Again, we'll talk about him in just a few minutes. So there were three theories of geological change that people regarded in the 18th century, and they are the following: catastrophism, gradualism, and uniformism. I'm going to be horrible at pronouncing that word. But anyway, catastrophism. Natural disasters such as floods and volcanic eruptions happen often during Earth's long history. And we can see that at the very, very beginning of Earth's history, which we'll see in a video. We have gradualism. Changes in landforms develop slowly over time due to natural processes, not catastrophic events. Well, maybe, yeah, this can be true, like the Grand Canyon and things like that. And then uniformitarianism, which present geological processes are keys to the past. So as we look at layers of rock, every layer of rock was formed by laying down of sediments that occur today. And so you have this sedimentation. So who was Charles Darwin? Well, Charles Darwin was a naturalist, which means he studied the natural environment. He was born in 1809 in England. He studied medicine, and he also had a degree in theology, which is the study of religion. He is very, very, very famous for coming up with the theory of natural selection and evolution. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes. He actually wrote a book about it called The Origin of Species. And this was a huge revelation at that point, which went against a lot of things that were happening in the church at that time, so it was pretty controversial. He got he was a little bit afraid to publish his book at first, but after hearing from a friend of his, Wallace, which we'll see in a video, it helped him push him towards publishing his book before Wallace came out with the ideas of natural selection. Anyway, Darwin, what did he do? He went on this 5-year voyage around the world on a ship called the HMS Beagle. On that voyage, because he was a naturalist at the time, he collected animals, fossils, studied plants, and he found evidence on this travels to find this new theory. So he found evidence to propose a revolutionary hypothesis about how life changes over time, and therefore we know that today is evolution. Here is a map of his voyage. You can see he went completely around the world. It's another one a little bit more clear. So actually, a lot of time that he spent, if you look back at that map, was around South America. Okay, and he spent some time on a place called the Galapagos Islands. And on these islands actually lay about 500 miles west of Ecuador. They're in the Pacific Ocean, directly over the equator, so it's nice and warm there. And Darwin noticed many variations among the plants and animals that were of the same kind or the same type as those that were found on the mainland of South America. And it made him start to think about these island species. And what he noticed is he started to see these variations from island to island based on the environments of those islands. Okay, and so one thing that he noticed were these things called variations, and a variation is just a difference in a physical trait. On the islands, they were full of these giant, and still are, tortoises, marine iguanas that swim in the ocean, these finches, little birds, all sorts of creatures that were very undisturbed by people because the Galapagos Islands aren't populated. There's one island that has people living on it, but that's about it. But he noticed that these creatures were the same as what were found on the mainland, but just with some different variations, and that they also varied from each other from island to island. So it really depended, and he figured this out, on what they actually had to eat. So these Galapagos tortoises that lived in areas that had tall plants that they had to like reach up to grab would have these arching shells so their necks could stretch up super tall so they could eat the plants. And then the tortoises that lived on places that were grassy, like in this picture, they didn't have to reach up tall to get their food, so they could eat from the ground. So they didn't have these long necks and arching shells. Same thing with the little finches or the little birds that they saw. They had all these different beak shapes depending on what was the most common food on the island. Finches that lived in areas that had hard shelled nuts had bigger, stronger beaks, and these ones that had like the little seeds and things, they had longer, more delicate looking beaks. And so what we've come to find out is these variations are actually adaptations. And adaptations are features that allow an organism to survive better in its environment. And species are able to adapt to their environment, and these environmental changes and adaptations lead to a genetic change in a population over a period of time. Now, when Darwin was making his observations, he found fossils as well. And these fossils actually were extinct animals that resembled modern day animals. And he also found fossils where he shouldn't find fossils, like at the top of mountains, he would find shells. And he's like, what? There's no water here. How did these get up here? And one thing Darwin did see is during an earthquake, he saw land actually during the earthquake move up over the water. And so he said, the earth does not stay the same. It changes over time. And I think these animals are also changing over time. As Darwin studied this a little bit more on how things change over time, Darwin started to notice a lot of variation in domesticated animals. Okay, domesticated animals are animals that we have lived closely with humans. We have trained them to live with us and help us out. Things like dogs. In Darwin's time, a lot of people raised pigeons, and they would have pigeon races and all sorts of things, and then they actually would eat pigeons as well. But what Darwin knew is that humans would actually select traits and breed animals for specific things that they liked. We call that artificial selection. So you want a dog breed, and maybe the dog that you have has this beautiful fur that you want to be passed on to the puppies. So you're going to take two dogs that have this beautiful fur and hopefully breed them together and get puppies that have the same thing. And over a period of time, you start to breed more and more traits of things that you want. And that's called artificial selection, where humans actually select the traits and then breed specific animals together to get those traits. Now, you know from studying genes that heritability is the ability of a trait to be passed down. And in nature, traits get passed down automatically, right? Generation to generation. In nature, we have competition. There's a struggle to survive. So if you're out there in the jungle trying to survive an animal, you're going to have to develop good hunting skills. You're going to have to develop good camouflage. You're going to have to develop all sorts of different things, strong jaws, strong teeth, whatever it is. And so competition leads to these adaptations. And so Darwin proposed that adaptations arose over many generations to help animals out there in nature to survive. okay? Like my picture down below, okay? I've got these giraffes, okay? The tree, the leaves are super, super tall, okay? As if we're having a lot of giraffes being born with short necks, they're not going to be able to reach those leaves, eventually leading to giraffes with longer and longer necks to reach up and grab the leaves that they want to eat. So in nature, nobody selects their own traits, right? Individuals that have traits that are best adapted for the current environment are the ones that live to survive, pass on their genes to the next generation. Organisms that don't have great adaptations will not survive and not pass on their genes. So this is called natural selection. So organisms that are best adapted to an environment survive and reproduce more than others, passing on their genes. So say you are a frog, right? You've got great spots, so you can be very, very, very camouflaged. That bird's not going to come down and eat you first because you're well camouflaged. So you're going to live to pass on those genes for good camouflage. But say if you're a bright green frog and you're in this little weedy patch, well, the bird might be able to pick you off first because he's going to see you, so you're not going to survive to pass on your genes. And that's natural selection. We call that survival of the fittest, sorry. The fittest things survive, okay? Most adapted to their environment. So natural selection explains how evolution can occur. There are four main principles to the theory of natural selection. We have variation, overproduction, adaptation, and then descent with modification. So in variation, each individual in a population has a unique combination of inherited traits, right? We're all unique, all have different traits. Overproduction. Each species in nature produces more offspring than can survive. Like, for example, my frogs, right? Frogs lay a lot of eggs. Are all those eggs going to turn into frogs? No, they're not, because a lot of them are going to get eaten up right from the jump. Adaptation, an inherited trait that increases an organism's chances for survival. And then descent with modification. Over time, natural selection results in species with adaptations that are well suited for survival and reproduction. So these slow changes over time lead to evolution. And we can think about it like this example. So say we have a populations of these little beetles living out there in the grass, or let's say it's out there in a little dirty, dusty patch in the sand. And it's full of green beetles first and brown beetles, okay? And if you're in the sand, which ones can you see better if you're a bird? Well, you're going to see those green beetles better than the brown beetles who have better camouflage for hiding in that sand. So eventually what's going to happen is those poor little green beetles are going to start getting eaten up faster than the sand-colored beetles, the brown ones, okay? So the brown ones are going to live longer and pass on their genes so that eventually that whole population is just going to be full of brown beetles. Maybe every once in a while a green one will be born, but again, it's going to get eaten fast, so it's going to not be able to pass on its genes. Same thing, let's say all of a sudden that sandy patch now turns lush and green, okay? Well, if you're a green beetle, you're going to survive better. So eventually, those little green ones that were getting eaten off faster are going to survive longer in this green patch than in the sand patch, and they're going to live longer and eventually turn into a population of green beetles. So we have that struggle for existence. So members of each species have to compete for food, shelter, other of life's necessities. And then we have the survival of the fittest. So some individuals are better suited for the environment, thus survive and pass on their genes. And that's basically how evolution works. So all of these things, this theory of natural selection, led Darwin into publishing all of his information that he discovered on the Galapagos Islands and his travels around the world into a book called The Origin of Species. And again, it was a very controversial book at that time because it went against what a lot of people thought, that the Earth was not very old and that everything stayed the same, nothing changed over time. Okay, so it was a huge, huge, huge deal. All right, and now we know it's true because there's a lot of evidence for evolution, which we will talk about in the next video. Thanks, guys.